Normalcy bias, and I've talked about this before. Most of you have probably heard me talk about this before, but it is an important, kind of an important phenomenon to understand what happens in the human brain. It's a psychological aspect that basically what it means is when we have a specific way in which we see how the world works, what we think is normal, and when something happens that occurs outside of the normal, then we tend to do one of two different things. Psychologically, we either reject it altogether that, well, no, there's no way that that could actually have happened because that's not normal, or we try to redefine it in some way or shape and form to try and make it normal. Um, and because of this, people find it very difficult to accept things that don't fit in with their expectations. And of course, when you look at what we're going to be getting into tonight with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that's one of the issues that actually comes into play here. And we'll talk more about that in a few moments. But as we saw before, Jesus had died on the cross, and just before he died, he declared the words, "It is finished." And we talked about that a couple weeks ago. It means not just that the work was done, though it does mean that, but the word can also be understood in terms of paid in full. And the exact phrase that Jesus used has been seen on ancient tax receipts, paid in full, saying that the work of Jesus was also complete and finished. We saw that Joseph and Nicodemus had taken his body down, and they hurriedly put it into this tomb, but they just did not have time to do all of the funeral preparations. They got done what they could get done, but because the Sabbath day was beginning at sundown, there just was not enough time to finish everything. And so the plan was, after the Passover and Sabbath were finished, then this other group of women would come in and they would basically finish the job of the burial process for Jesus. And that's where chapter 19 leaves off. And you come to chapter 20, and it says, "On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. And she saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb, so she ran to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, the one who Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him.' At that, Peter and the other disciple went out, heading for the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and got to the tomb first. And stooping down, he saw the linen cloths lying there, yet he did not go in. Then, following him, Simon Peter came also, and he entered the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying there. The wrapping that had been on his head was not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a separate place by itself. The other disciples who had reached the tomb first then entered the tomb and saw and believed, for they still did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went home again, but Mary stood outside facing the tomb, crying. And as she was crying, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head and one at the feet, where Jesus' body had been laying. And they said to her, 'Woman, why are you crying?' 'Because they've taken away my Lord,' she told him, 'and I don't know where they've put him.' Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, though she did not know it was Jesus. 'Woman,' Jesus said to her, 'why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?' Supposing he was the gardener, she replied, 'Sir, if you've removed him, tell me where you've put him, and I will take him away.' And Jesus said, 'Mary,' and turning around, she said to him in Hebrew, 'Rabboni,' which means teacher. 'Don't cling to me,' Jesus told her, 'for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God.' And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, 'I have seen the Lord,' and she told them what he had said to her. So the first day of the week was Sunday. And of course, the Sunday would have actually started at sundown the night before on the Hebrew calendar. So that's how they're timing this. Mary was coming to the tomb, and she was there very, very early, before even the sun had arisen. And again, this just shows you that not only Mary's dedication, there was a group of women that also went as well. And it tells you really just how dedicated they were to Jesus. And that they're willing to show up and to do this job and to finish this job, even though in their minds Jesus is dead. Everything else was, it seemed like the hope and the dreams that came with Jesus were as dead as he seemed to be, but they're still willing to go in and to honor him in this way. Now, there were a lot of other events that happened that morning. I've given you a note at the end of these notes from Charles Ryrie as he kind of lays out the various appearances of the resurrection. But John is not trying to give us a full view of everything that happened that morning. John is focused on one specific event. That is his focus in this. Because John himself is going to say a couple times before we get to the end of John, or by the time we get to the end of John, that there was a whole lot of other things that Jesus did that he did not record. And it's important to note that John's not trying to give us a comprehensive description of the entire life and ministry of Jesus. He wants to focus on specific events, and this is one of the specific events that he's focusing on. So, when Mary goes there, she gets to the tomb, she finds the tomb empty. Now, again, we know that prior to her arrival, there had been an earthquake, that an angel had descended, that the Roman guards had collapsed, had fainted basically. The angel had rolled away the tomb, or the stone from the tomb. We know all of that. Because Mary gets there and she finds the tomb open and empty. And her immediate thought is, I need to go back and I need to tell the apostles. And the apostles, they were still in Jerusalem, but they were in hiding. The members of that first church that Jesus had built, they knew where the apostles were, but the apostles themselves were avoiding any public appearance because they're all scared that they were going to be next. After what they did to Jesus, they're scared if we show our face, they're going to come after us. Which, to a certain extent, seems kind of a pointless fear, because remember, even the people who had been present at Jesus' arrest didn't even recognize Peter when he was at the house of Caiaphas. They just thought, hey, didn't I see you? You look familiar. You look like one of those guys. But they didn't actually recognize him. To be perfectly honest, none of them were actually wanted. They were just, the opinion was if we cut off the head of the snake, then the rest of it dies. That's how they viewed Jesus. They weren't concerned with the others. But she gets to Peter and John, and to be fair, she probably, she had rushed there. She was excited. She was upset. She probably had a hard time trying to explain what had happened. What Peter and John get out of it is the tomb was open, Jesus wasn't there. And so they take off to go run and to check it out themselves. And they're followed by Mary. Now what we're told here is that they take off, Peter takes off, and John take off, but John outruns Peter. And generally, the reason why is probably not because John was so much more devoted than Peter or anything like that. It's that John is generally believed to be the youngest of the apostles. It was probably a youth issue. He was younger and in probably a little bit better shape. So he was a little bit faster than Peter was. So John arrives there first, but John doesn't go into the tomb. He just gets there and he kind of stoops down, he looks through. And again, when it says that he stooped down, they were not, full-size doors for a full-size adult, even though most people in that day and age were shorter than people are today. It still was it was a door that was cut into the rock, and it was not designed to be a full-size door for someone to walk through. So, it was big enough to get the bodies in and for people to get in, take care of it, and that's it. And so John has to go in. He kind of bends down, is looking in the tomb, and he sees, because remember, it was a new tomb. And again, it was not going to be a tomb that was just for solo use. That's not how they did tombs. They did them more in a mausoleum style structure. The place where Jesus' body had been laid, there was no body there. The wrappings that they put around the body were still there. They were just laying there on that shelf, but the body was gone. Well, Peter gets there just a few minutes later, or a few moments later, and he barrels right on into the tomb. He doesn't stop to look in. He goes inside, and when Peter goes in there, he finds something else, because it says that laid apart, laid aside, because remember, there are different shelves because it was for multiple bodies. Usually for an entire family that is what this tomb was carved for. And so there would be different places for different bodies there. On another one was the cloth that had specifically been used to cover the face of Jesus, and it was laid neatly folded. Not just laid aside, not just tossed aside, not just collapsed. It's been folded and set aside very carefully. Now, what this tells them, and what this should tell everyone, is something weird happened. Because if it was a grave robber, they wouldn't have stopped to unwrap the body, and they definitely wouldn't have stopped to fold up the cloth that had been covering his face and to set it there so it's all nice and neat. If it had been Roman soldiers trying to remove the body because they were scared that it would be stolen by the apostles, which that was one of the fear, they wouldn't have unwrapped it. They wouldn't have done that either. The mere fact that the wrappings had been removed and that cloth had been set there tells you that whatever happened was strange, out of the ordinary. It was not something easily explained. Peter comes out scratching his head. He knows that something weird's happened. He doesn't necessarily think anything miraculous has happened, but he comes out scratching his head, not sure what's going on. We're told that John, and it's kind of a strange phrase here in verse 8, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, then entered the tomb, saw and believed. So the question is what did John believe? Because the very next verse tells us that they still did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So clearly, whatever John believed was not that Jesus had been resurrected. He believed something. Now, most likely the structure of this sentence and the structure of this phrase suggests that John believes that something miraculous had happened, but not the resurrection. That God had been up to something, because those wrappings are still there, the face wrapping is still there, neatly folded. No one's going to do that. Something miraculous happened, but I don't have any idea what it is. Peter comes out, has nothing. He's scratching his head. Now, some commentators actually hold that what John believed was that he believed that the body of Jesus had been stolen. It's possible that that's what that means, but I don't think it is, just simply by the structure of this. Because John likely would have said that if that's what it was, he probably would have come out and said, I believe that the body of Jesus had been stolen. But that's not what he says. It says that he believed, period. So it's likely that John believes something miraculous had happened. He just didn't know what, couldn't explain it. Now again, to be fair, you had situations where you had, in the Old Testament, you had both Enoch and Elijah who were translated from this earth directly to heaven and did not die. You had other people like Moses who when he died, the Lord buried him specially in a tomb that no one knows where it is. So it could be that John is thinking something in the lines of that. But we just don't know exactly what it is. But likely it is that John believed that something miraculous had happened, just not the resurrection, because they didn't understand the resurrection. They didn't understand the Old Testament prophecies, such as in Psalm 16, 9 through 10, that the Messiah would be resurrected. But they realize there's nothing more to be doing here. Because the body of Jesus is in here, the wrappings are still here, and it's not likely that, the body's going to show back up here if it's been removed either by grave robbers, by the Roman soldiers, or by God himself. Don't expect the body to show back up in the tomb. So with nothing else, what else are they going to do? They go back to the place where they've been staying. And they just leave Mary there, all by herself. And she's been standing outside, weeping and crying, because Jesus was her Lord. Even in his death, he was still Lord to her. And so she decides to look in the tomb. And this is where Mary's normalcy bias starts to come into play. Because she looks into the tomb and she sees these two angels sitting there. One on either side of the shelf that Jesus had been, where his body had been laid. She sees these two angels sitting there, and they ask her. They speak to her. They said to her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She says, "Because they've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." And it never seems to occur to her in this moment. In the moment that Peter and John had just gone into the tomb. And when they were in the tomb, there wasn't anyone there. It doesn't seem to occur to her at all that Peter and John didn't have any conversations with anyone in there. And she was standing outside. And now she looks, and there are these two angels sitting there. And in her mind, she just accepts it as, there's two people in the tomb. They ask her a question, "Why are you crying?" She tells them. She just answers the question. It doesn't hit her at the moment how strange the event really is. And it doesn't even occur to her that she's talking to a couple of angels. Because in her mind, angels don't just show up to anyone. They show up to prophets. They show up to the important people in history. They don't talk to some woman who used to be demon-possessed. So they can't be angels. Even though she never sees them go in, they're just there. And so she turns around and hears someone standing behind her. And it's Jesus. Now here's what you need to understand something. When Jesus was resurrected bodily, he still looked like Jesus. He had not changed so significantly, and he was not revealing himself in his glory in such a way that he was unrecognizable. But every time you have these people begin to see Jesus, specifically this day, none of them initially recognize him as being Jesus. And it's not because Jesus has changed. Because we're going to see later on in this chapter that when Jesus shows it and appears with the apostles, he still has the nail prints. He still has the hole in his side. A week later, when he appears and shows to Thomas, and he says, "Thomas, feel it for yourself." Jesus had not so physically in his appearance changed that he could not be recognized. So why didn't Mary recognize him? Because Jesus, in her mind, is dead. And people don't come back from the dead. Dead is dead. Yes, there is life beyond death, but that's eternal life. That's heaven. And it's strange because we know that Jesus at least 3 times raised people from the dead, but the thought that Jesus himself would be raised from the dead was so foreign to their minds that they could not accept that Jesus was the one that they were talking to. And Mary just assumes, and this is what the Bible actually tells us. It says that she turned around, saw Jesus standing there, though she did not know who it was. He says, "Woman, why are you crying?" And supposing he was the gardener. She is coming up with an explanation. Wow, didn't hear the gardener show up. Man, he kind of looks familiar to me, but he must be the gardener. That's what's happening in her mind. It can't be Jesus. It has to be the gardener. It can't be a miracle. There has to be some other explanation for it, right? Because God doesn't actually do miracles, does he? Yes, he does. But it's just not occurring to her. And you think about it, how many times had all of these disciples, not just the apostles, but the disciples in general, how many miracles have they personally witnessed Jesus perform? And the idea that Jesus could be standing in front of her even though he died just never occurs to her, despite everything. And she says, hey, if you know where they took Jesus, in the most ironic statement ever, he's standing right in front of her. If you know where they took his body, he's there bodily, then just let me know. And that way I can see to him. And apparently she kind of bows her head, turns back, kind of crying, weeping. And then Jesus breaks through her brain fog with a very simple 4-letter word. He speaks her name, Mary. And everything changes. In that moment, everything changes because Mary goes from a moment of weeping and crying and despair because every hope that she had, her Savior, her Lord, has died. And now his body is missing. And she goes from a moment of complete despair to a moment of unbridled joy and hope. My teacher, my rabbi. And what John doesn't tell us here, but we can infer from the context, is that Mary didn't just turn around and say, Rabbi. She turns around and she runs to Jesus and she puts him in a giant bear hug. She is so excited, so thrilled, that she has to grab onto Jesus. She has to hold on to him. And it's funny because you look at the statement of Jesus, the commandment, he says, don't cling to me. He is not rebuking Mary, first of all. Don't misunderstand. This is not a rebuke, and I don't think Jesus is being harsh, nor is he saying, I am too holy for you to touch, or anything like that. The reality is, Mary was holding on to him like she never wanted to let him go again. And the simple truth is Jesus had more work to do that morning. And he had work for Mary to do that morning. He says, no. I haven't ascended yet. When you get to heaven, Mary, you can hold on as tight as you want to. But for right now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back to the apostles, to my brothers. And I want you to tell them what happened. I want you to tell them that I'm alive. I want you to tell them that I am going to be ascending back to the Father soon. And by the way, he gives other commands to the other women that he met that morning as well. Tell them that I will meet them and see them in Galilee. And so you have these pebbles start to fall with the apostles. As messengers come back, Mary goes back, and she does exactly what she's told. She comes back, and this time the report is not that the tomb was empty, and we don't know where his body is taken. The report comes back that Jesus is alive. That the reason the tomb is empty is because he has conquered death. The reason that the grave clothes are there is because the grave clothes belong in the grave. Jesus doesn't. And so the word starts to tumble out. And of course, the other women would encounter Jesus that morning as well, and they would come back with their reports. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus that evening, or as they were traveling back to Emmaus, Jesus would show up and start walking and talking with them, and it takes them all evening to figure out what's going on. And then suddenly, when it clicks for them, they come rushing back. Hey, guess what? That night, Jesus appears to the apostles minus Thomas and speaks to them. We'll look at that next week. Or not next week, in the next session. But time after time after time. And it just starts happening over and over and over again. And again, the references that I give in the note down here, that from Thomas Ryrie, or from Charles Ryrie, excuse me, that's probably not the sum total of the times that Jesus would appear over the next 40 days. We don't know, and there is no way of knowing how many times Jesus appeared to different people over the course of 40 days. I mean, just in the first day, he appears to a couple dozen people. Imagine what he did over the rest of that first week and the next month. But in a day that starts off in defeat, in sorrow, in weeping, in an instant, it becomes a day of rejoicing, a day of celebration, and a day of victory. Because just like Jesus said, like he had been telling them since he said, I was going to build my church in Matthew 16, he had been telling them that he was going to die, be buried, and be resurrected. And no one saw it coming. But when it happened, it changed everything.